Walter Guidry had balanced Louis Armstrong's books for 11 years before he found the entry that didn't make sense. It was 1969, buried on the oldest page of a ledger nobody had touched since the war. A monthly payment, same amount, same date, 40 years running, made out to an address in Louisiana that wasn't a hotel, a union hall, or a relative's name Walter recognized. What that entry led him to, tucked behind a filing cabinet in Joe Glazer's management office on 7th Avenue, was a promise Louis Armstrong had kept in secret since he was 27 years old and had never once broken. Not through bankruptcy, not through war, not through a single missed payroll in 40 years of touring the world. New York City, Joe Glazer Associates, 7th Avenue. A Tuesday afternoon in March of 1969. Walter was 41, married, careful with numbers the way other men were careful with matches near gasoline. He had signed off on Louis Armstrong's expenses since 1958, hotel bills, horn repairs, band payroll, Lucille's household accounts, and he thought he'd seen every recurring line in the man's finances. He hadn't seen this one. He pulled the thread anyway. To understand the name at the bottom of that ledger, you have to go back further than Walter's filing cabinet. You have to go back to New Orleans, to a house on Perdido Street, and to a boy nobody outside that family ever heard mentioned on a record label. His name was Clarence Armstrong, born in 1915, the son of Louis's cousin Flora, a young woman who worked long hours and had little help raising a child alone in a neighborhood where help was scarce for everybody. Louis was 14 when Clarence was born, already blowing a battered cornet around the honky-tonks of the battlefield, already the kind of teenager neighbors described as steadier than his age suggested. Flora leaned on him. Louis let her. He'd carry that baby around like the boy was made of glass, a neighbor on Perdido Street would say decades later, remembering a teenager who had almost nothing of his own and still made room for a cousin's son. Louis was still years from his first professional booking, still learning cornet from the older men who ran the honky-tonks, still a boy himself in most of the ways that mattered. None of that stopped him from showing up at Flora's door most evenings, asking after the baby before he asked after anything else. Clarence took to Louis before he took to almost anyone. By the time Clarence was 3, it was Louis's name the boy said first when he wanted picking up. Then came the accident that split the family's life into a before and an after. Clarence was climbing where a 3-year-old had no business climbing, a stack of loose lumber behind a neighbor's fence, when a plank shifted and came down across the back of his head. He didn't cry the way the family expected a hurt child to cry. He went quiet. Too quiet. By evening, he had a fever that wouldn't break, and by the next week, the doctor who examined him gave Flora words no mother wants translated back to her plainly. The boy would carry a disability for the rest of his life. His mind would stay, in important ways, a child's. Flora did what she could. It wasn't enough, and not for lack of love. New Orleans in the 1910s offered almost nothing for a family in her position. There were no state programs for a child with Clarence's condition, no waiting list to join, no caseworker to call. There was a mother working what hours she could find, and a boy who needed watching every hour she couldn't. When Flora herself died young, not many years later, there was no formal system waiting to catch Clarence. There was only a cousin, barely into adulthood, without steady money, without a wife yet, without anything but a horn and a name, starting to travel outside Louisiana. Louis Armstrong took him anyway. "That's my son," Louis told anyone who asked, and kept telling them for the rest of his life. Never "my cousin's boy," never "the one I look after," just "my son." He said it in New Orleans. He said it in Chicago. He said it decades later to reporters who didn't always know what to write down. Money was the problem for years. In the early 1920s, Louis was a sideman living out of rented rooms, sending what he could back home, playing riverboats and rent parties for dollars that disappeared as fast as they arrived. Caring for Clarence meant paying other people to do what Louis couldn't do himself while on the road. A home, later a specialized facility. Caretakers who understood a grown man with a child's understanding needed patience most jobs didn't pay for. Every raise Louis got, a piece of it was already spoken for before he cashed the check. There were weeks he ate less so the payment could go out whole. Weeks he borrowed against next month's fee from a band leader he was subbing for. Weeks the only steady thing in a musician's chaotic income was the one obligation nobody else on the bandstand even knew existed. Bandmates who traveled with him for years came to understand there was an obligation that traveled with him too. Quiet, unglamorous, never explained in the papers, never brought up unless Louis brought it up first, which he almost never did. There was a check that had to go out every month, no matter where we were, one member of his band said years afterward. Wasn't extra. Wasn't a bonus somebody was owed. It was just, that one goes first. Before the hotel. Before us, some months. By the late 1920s, as Hot 5 records started selling and Louis's name began appearing on marquees instead of just riverboat programs, the arrangement didn't loosen. It hardened into something closer to a rule. The rule was tested hardest in 1931. Louis's finances that year were a mess of overlapping managers, unpaid taxes, and a band payroll that sometimes came up short by Friday. More than one musician went a week without full pay. Hotel bills piled up in 3 cities at once. It was the kind of year where a man trims what he can trim, quietly, and hopes nobody notices which corners got cut. One corner never got cut. The payment to Clarence's caretakers went out that month the same as always, full amount, same date, hand-delivered by whichever manager was closest to a bank that week when the mail couldn't be trusted to make it in time. Musicians who'd gone without full pay that same month later remembered being told, when they asked why one bill got settled before theirs did, "Not that one. That one doesn't wait." That's when the shape of the promise became visible to the people around him, not through anything Louis said, but through what he refused, every single time, to let slide. It held through worse years than 1931. It held through the war, when touring income dropped, gas rationing gutted the one-nighters that used to fill a band's calendar, and travel itself became a logistical fight most weeks. It held through the early 1940s, when Louis dissolved his big band entirely and rebuilt his career from something smaller and leaner, the All-Stars, at an age when most band leaders were retiring rather than starting over from a nightclub stage. It held through the 1950s, when the State Department sent him overseas for months at a stretch as Ambassador Satch, playing for crowds who'd never heard an American horn in person, the payment still finding its way home across an ocean of forwarded mail and wired instructions. Whatever else changed, the size of his band, the style of the music, the country he was performing in that month, the payment for Clarence's care did not change. 40 years, uninterrupted. Louis visited when tours allowed it. He'd bring Clarence small gifts, sit with him, Talk to him the way you'd talk to family, and not the way institutions had trained most visitors to talk to residents like him. No lowered voice, no careful distance. Staff at the facilities that cared for Clarence over the decades came to recognize the pattern. When Louis Armstrong came through town, he came to see his son before he did almost anything else on the schedule. Sometimes still in his traveling clothes, horn case still in the car. He never once introduced Clarence like it was something to explain, a longtime caretaker recalled. Other men in his position might have been embarrassed, or hidden it, or made excuses. He just said, "This is my son," like that settled the matter. Because to him, it did. Reporters occasionally came close to the story, and Louis steered them away from it every time. Not out of shame, but out of something closer to protection. Clarence hadn't chosen fame, and Louis wasn't going to let his son become a headline, a sympathy angle, a paragraph in a magazine profile written by someone who'd never met him. Louis Armstrong, a man who spent his public life turning nearly everything about himself into a performance for the world's benefit, drew a hard, permanent line around this one part of it. "Some things are mine," he reportedly told a friend late in his life, when asked why he never spoke about Clarence on television the way he spoke about nearly everything else. "That's mine to carry, not for the folks in the seats." More than one journalist got close over the years. A mention of family in Louisiana, a stray question about who else lived on Louis's payroll. And each time, Louis turned the conversation back toward music before the reporter realized the door had already closed. Those who worked closest to him learned not to push. It wasn't anger that stopped them. It was the quiet, immovable calm of a man who had already decided, decades earlier, exactly how much of this belonged to strangers. And the number was 0. He carried it for 40 years without missing a payment, without a single public complaint, without ever once, in interview after interview about his childhood, his horn, his marriages, his music, volunteering the one fact that would have made him look, to a 1960s audience, even more admirable than they already thought him to be. He didn't need the credit. He'd already decided what the money was for. Louis Armstrong died in his sleep on July 6, 1971, in the house on 107th Street in Corona, Queens, that he shared with Lucille. Clarence outlived him by 27 years. The arrangements Louis had built, through Joe Glazer's office, then through the estate after Glazer himself had passed, continued exactly as they always had. The check still went out. The caretakers still received it. Nothing about the promise required Louis to be alive to keep it. He had built it to outlast him, on purpose. The way a man builds something he doesn't ever want to depend on his own survival. Clarence Armstrong died in 1998, having spent his entire life within the boundary of a promise made by a 14-year-old boy holding a baby cousin on Perdido Street. A promise that never once, across nearly 6 decades, came due for renegotiation. He had outlived the man who made that promise by 27 years, and for every one of them, the arrangement Louis built simply kept running, untouched, exactly the way a man builds a thing he intends to survive him. Walter Guidry, going through those old ledgers in 1969, didn't find a scandal. He found the opposite of one. 4 decades of a rich, famous, constantly traveling man, quietly making sure one vulnerable relative never went without,
and never once turning it into a story for the public to admire him for. He sat with the ledger a long while that afternoon, the office quiet, traffic moving 12 floors below on 7th Avenue, and understood he was looking at the one account in the whole business nobody had ever needed to audit, because it had never once been wrong.
In the back of the oldest folder, behind a decade of receipts, was a single handwritten note in Louis's handwriting, undated, that Walter kept for himself rather than filing away. Take care of my son, no matter what. It is, today, the only line in that ledger anyone still remembers. Fans who can recite every session date on West End Blues, who know the exact bar where he held that famous scat break in 1926, who can tell you what year he met Lucille and what year he played for the Pope. Most of them have never heard Clarence Armstrong's name at all. Even people who worked alongside Louis for years, who could tell you his shoe size and his favorite brand of gauze for his lips, mostly only ever knew there was a check that went out every month, and knew better than to ask more than that. That was, in the end, exactly how Louis Armstrong wanted it. Not hidden out of shame, just kept, the way a man keeps the one thing that was never anybody else's business but his own. Some promises aren't made to be witnessed. They're made to be kept. If a story like this one stayed with you, consider subscribing for more of these hidden histories. And tell us in the comments, has anyone in your own family ever quietly kept a promise like that? One nobody outside the family ever knew about?